So we're doing this thing sort of in homage to Ced, yeah?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because when you first would have would have been aware of Cedric, well, you'd have been aware of. First met him would have been recording Warriors, wouldn't it?
Yeah, although the way they did the record was a bit piecemeal, you know. So when I did my tracks, there wasn't anything recorded by those guys. Everything I recorded to was just like a Linn drum machine and some like synth sounds, just some sort of, you know, random synth sounds in the background and maybe a few droney bass things that Gary had kind of put in, but he didn't have any tunes. I think we kind of went through that in the last interview that we had, but that recording Warriors was really just kind of making it up as we went along.
Mm.
And it was primarily the all the core stuff was really primarily between me and Bill. I mean, Gary might have had a few of those ideas, laying down some of those basic synth tracks in the beginning, but he wasn't that involved, in it. He'd kind of come in and listen and go, "Yeah, that's great," and occasionally read me the lyrics to one of the tunes, but it was kind of like, okay, you know,
Yeah,
you know what I mean? So it was, and there was a lot of experimentation done with recording the bass because I recorded on all the tracks, I recorded probably 4 to 6 bass tracks, overdubbed melodies, chords, harmonic things. And then when they mixed the record, they, obviously they had Gary's vocal, the rest of the band to put in, and they did all the arranging kind of after I put my stuff on there.
sure.
So they pulled a lot of stuff I did out of it, kept the essential things, um, and that's kind of how that went.
Mm.
But yeah, so I never played with Sed until we got to the rehearsals.
Right.
But always loved his playing. I mean, he was like a 2 and 4 merchant. Man, that was his whole thing. Was like a big snare on 2 and 4.
Right.
The
Yeah.
bigger and the bigger the better. But his time was really good. He had a very good sense of time, which um, like what a lot of people don't realize is that tour was in 1983,
Mm.
and Gary he did a lot of stuff where he had backing tracks. So it wasn't like, we didn't have MIDI. It was actually before MIDI,
Mm.
that Warriors tour. And that's why, like Chris had like 12 keyboards.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? If MIDI had been around, I think MIDI came out just after we finished the tour. It was around that time, and but so Gary would do the backing tracks with reel to reels.
Right.
He'd have reel to reels running, and said had a click fed to him, and he played the whole show with a click track, which really in those days not many people were doing.
Right.
Now everyone does that, like
Yeah. Yeah.
in the pop world, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In the pop world everyone does that, but back then he did that, so his time was really good. It had to be, because he would have never been able to do that gig if it wasn't.
Yeah. I suppose if you've got a tape, you can't really. Well, it wouldn't look good to stop it and start again, would it?
Well, it has to be, it has to go. And you see, a lot of those, it was quite intricate, actually, the way Gary did that, because a lot of the parts that were on tape were just incidental things.
Mm.
They weren't things that were like running
Yeah.
through
Yeah.
the whole thing. So if it got off of that, the whole show would have fallen apart. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And so we rehearsed a lot. I mean, there was like 9 weeks of rehearsal. I think it was insane.
It was a big tour, wasn't it? It was nearly
Yeah.
40 dates. Maybe one was cancelled or two. I don't know.
Yeah,
Something like
no,
that.
no, it was like I think it was about 42 days that
Mm,
that we had, and yeah, I mean, it was full on as well. I mean, literally, it was almost back to back, that whole tour. And um, so it was busy, and it was a good. Um, I don't want to use. I'm trying to think of an adjective. Not hard is not, the right way to put it, but it was a demanding show
mm,
for the players because it was a full on energy thing. I mean, like that band had so much energy, it was like unbelievable.
mm.
It was like a sort of RPG was being fired off the stage at every point. So,
Yeah.
the drums are a very physical instrument. Ced was, he held up his end of the bargain, as everyone did in the band. It
Mm,
was a great band, and uh, but it was demanding to do that tour because it was just full on, like every day. Every day was absolutely full on, and the band kind of delivered full on every single night. Like,
mm,
I don't remember us having a bad show. I don't remember us, um, where there was things that went wrong. You
mm.
know, sometimes some of the gear, like they were kind of challenged, especially with the keyboards, because it wasn't MIDI and there was so much gear, and the way Gary's set was,
Yeah.
had
Yeah.
those two like checkpoint Charlie towers, and of course that's where the keyboards were, in both of those towers. And I mean, John, Gary's brother, was in one tower, and of course he was miming to everything, so Chris was actually playing everything.
Mm,
But nevertheless, things would go wrong with his keyboard setup, like, all the time. And the crew were brilliant. I mean, those guys were flying around up on those things like monkeys. I mean, it was insane. It's saying how, like, how much they had to kind of be on it because little things could happen. But other than those little technical snags, with maybe some gear issues, going a bit array, the it was very tight, like, for the entire run.
How
You
did
know.
you get on with all the band members?
Oh, really well. I mean, this was the thing. We were a band from day one, and because, like, Paul, who was, I mean, those guys, Russell, Chris, and Ced, they were part of the original Numan band,
Mm,
right? With cars and all those, those things that sort of started the whole thing. And Paul was the bass player, but sadly, around that time, he was like not, he had like some drug problems and stuff. And in fact, on that tour, he ended up passing away.
mm.
And
Yeah.
he did come to a few gigs, but he really wasn't, in the right frame of mind, to be doing anything. And I think that could have been originally Gary's plan, was to get that whole band back, but Paul was not fit for purpose.
Mm,
So when I came in, I was kind of an outsider, and like, Gary loved the way that Pino Palladino played on I Assassin, and Pino had moved on. He was doing like Paul Young's gigs and stuff. So um, the engineer, the history behind it, it's kind of funny because in Gary's book, um, what was it called? Something about the aliens.
Oh, praying to the aliens.
Praying to
Yeah.
the aliens. In his book, he wrote in there that Pino Palladino recommended me for that gig, but
Mm,
that's not how that happened. The guy who recommended me for the gig was Nick Smith, and
yeah.
Nick was the engineer at Rock City.
Mm,
And before I had the gig with Gary, I used to do a lot of sessions at Rock City. In fact, I recorded Jim Mullen's album called Thumbs Up there. I recorded Bill Sharp's album,
Yeah.
Famous People. Worked a lot with Nigel Wright, who was also in Shack Attack, who now, he went on to be like the guy who wrote all the stuff for X Factor and all the American
Right.
Idol and all
Okay.
those things. But I did a lot of work for him in Rock City. So I was kind of a regular. And Nick, I had grown to be quite close to, and he used to recommend me a lot for different things,
Mm.
and I think that's the story that Nick told me was that one day they were sitting there and uh, Gary said, right about now is where we need Pino in to, get some of those kind of ideas he had on I Assassin. And Nick Smith said, well, why don't you get Joe Hubbard? He's the guy who taught Pino. And he said, all right, give him a call. Let's get him in, and that's how that happened.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
So as coming in as an outsider, those guys already had their little niche, and then they had worked with Gary before. But we all got on. All those guys were hysterical. We had a great time together. Like Chris and Russell and said there was a lot of pranking that went on like throughout the whole tour. And then at the end of the tour, what a lot of guys don't realize is they asked me to join Dramatis.
mm.
And of course, Dramatis, their future was kind of doomed, I think, pretty much from the end of the first record that they had done, or they may have done a couple, but I think they only did one record, and then that was kind of when before Warriors started. But the idea was to do another record with Dramatis on the back of the idea that Warriors was kind of, might not have been like a complete hit thing,
Mm.
but he had a couple of, maybe top 30 hits. Sister Surprise and I think Warriors maybe even got top 10, something like that. And so the guy, the Russell and Sed and Chris had been in touch with their management, and which was John Reed from Rocket Records, and they wanted to get this thing back together. Sadly, the whole thing fell apart, and it was basically because they wanted to turn it into the only way that John Reed thought that he could make money with Dramatis at this stage of the game was if he did, like, do you remember back in the 80s they used to do those K-Tel
Yeah.
records
Yeah. Yeah.
where a rock band plays the classics,
Yeah.
and it would be like a rock band playing like a Bach piece or something, and that's what they wanted to do. And I was the only one that I just said I can't be involved with it then. You know
Mm.
what I mean? And it can't happen on those terms because that was kind of a cheesy thing for me,
Yeah.
to really we're going to step down and like cover like these like lame like classical
Yeah. Yeah.
arrangements, and not have an identity as the band that we were.
Mm.
So I kind of bowed out of that, as it was getting started. But I don't think anything ever came through with that for those guys either. I think the whole thing might have just fallen apart.
I believe so, and in fact, I know after our last interview, I spoke to Chris about something, and he said, Joe said he was in Dramatis. I thought, what the fuck? No, he wasn't. He said, yes, he was. He completely forgot. But yeah. So
Yeah. I mean, that was the thing. They wanted to do that. So yeah, we were all friends and had a great time. Doing the tour. I mean, it was an intense tour. I'm not saying any of us didn't get under each other's skin now and again.
yeah.
I'm sure that happened, but because you're living on top of each other. I mean, we had like the full-on tour bus with the sleepers, and although it really wasn't a bus tour, there was maybe like some like these days now, big rock bands, they just do bus tours. They don't stay in
Yeah,
hotels anymore. You know what I mean?
yeah.
But back then it was done properly. I mean, and I gotta say, with Gary, um, you know, and I've worked with a lot of other big name artists and done tours where if you're in the band, sometimes you can be kind of like considered a little bit of a second class citizen.
Right.
But that wasn't the case with Gary. Gary was always cool. You know, wherever he went, he would invite us to be there right by him. You know what I mean? So, you know, I remember the first time that I experienced this, we had a record signing at HMV in Oxford Street, and he said, you know, I'll send a car to pick you up. You know, I thought he was just going to send like Addison Lee, the cab company. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
To
yeah.
just pick me up like a mini cab. But he sent the full stretch limousine, you know, and that was just for me. I mean, literally, he's just sent that for me. All the other guys, they had all their own transport there as well, and it was done properly, you know. And I always appreciated that with him. You know, like if he was going anywhere to do anything while we were on the road, he would always invite all of us to be there with him and experience that whole thing. Traveling, he traveled with us. You know, it was all equal, you know, in that sense. Same hotels, everything. I've been with other acts where it isn't like that. You know, the star of the act is in a great hotel and you're like in, you know, something a little bit more substandard.
But then, was it just after Warriors then you worked with Tik and Tok, Tim and Sean, or was it during? That would have been after, wouldn't it?
That was just after Warriors. Yeah, because they're another you know, group of guys that, you know, they were, again, they were the support band, but
Yeah.
we were all brothers. I mean, you know, we were all hanging, you know, like as though we were really in the same band. You know, that was how tight everyone was. And yeah, they then I can't remember the name of that record. What's the name of the
Or
record?
was it Intolerance or something?
Intolerance. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they had I remember the name of that one tune, A Date with the Palm Sisters. You know, sort of, I guess that would be banned now.
Oh yeah.
But you know, there was some cool stuff, and I think I played like on, I don't know, maybe like 3 or 4 tracks on that record, and then the rest of it was a bit programmed, you know.
Right. Okay.
They were trying to go down that vibe, but that was a really good experience, you know. I did that whole record in one session, and you know, those guys, real fond memories from them, you know. I remember a funny story about them was, they used to have this thing that they did with, they had these cone head masks.
Hmm.
You remember that movie called The Coneheads?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, with Dan Aykroyd. It was
Yeah.
about like the aliens sort of came. And so they had these conehead masks, and they then wear these trench coats,
That's it.
and they'd call themselves Reggie and Ronnie.
Yeah.
And these masks, man, were like totally unnerving. I mean, they were really, really unnerving. And the guy who used to drive the bus, I think his name was Brian. Am I right or wrong?
Oh, I wouldn't know for the.
Brian, because he was, again, like everyone was kind of like family. Like, you know, like Tony and Beryl used to travel with us as well, which was Gary's mom and dad. And Brian, I think, was the bus driver. And you know, he was just like, you know, sort of old timer kind of guy, you know. And I remember I got into, you know, we were staying in some hotel, and I get into the elevator, and Brian's in there, you know. And I said, "Oh, hey, man, we're, you know, just going down to the lobby, to the bar or something." And we stop at the next floor, and Tik and Tok walk on dressed in the Reggie and
Yeah.
Ronnie thing. You know, this is like after a gig.
Yeah.
We've
Yeah.
done the gig, you know, and I guess we're all meeting in the bar. And they come in and they just like stand there. They don't say anything to anyone, but Brian was like so unnerved from the way that this looked. It was really creepy, you know. Those guys were hysterical. Really, totally funny, man. Totally funny, those guys. But yeah, so that was a good experience too. Working with them.
I mean, if you had to, well, sum your short period of time with Gary and the band, how would you sum that up?
I'd say as a great learning experience, it taught me a lot. My background came much more from a sort of jazz background as a musician. And of course I played like, stuff that was like sort of a fusion of like funk and jazz and this kind of stuff, but it was always more music driven.
Mm,
Of course, that gig was my first like pop gig, that I did. And I had played on some pop records before that, and of course done a few different very low level type pop gigs. But that was the first big thing that I did, and those guys turned me on to a lot of the importance in that genre versus the way it is really in the sort of when you play jazz. It's much more just focused on like the musicianship.
yeah,
And there, like the whole idea of the show that Gary put on and the way that he would be like the architect of this whole thing from beginning to end. I mean, he was like every little detail about the lights, about the props on the stage. There was one thing that we played where he had these like cone things on the floor. They were all lit up, and it kind of made you look as though you were in some kind of prism.
yeah, yeah.
And he would orchestrate all of this stuff. He'd have it all written down. Like everything was very precise. For you knew kind of exactly what you were going to be doing for that whole show. You could improvise a little bit too, and he wanted that with me and Russell
Mm,
on the stage, because me and Russell were really on the stage with him. You had Chris and John were in those towers, and then you had Ced, which was on this like huge drum riser,
yeah.
which was he was trying to create on the Warriors thing. He told me he was trying to create a scene from the movie Escape from New York.
All right.
Yeah, that was
Yeah,
his vibe, where the Ced was kind of like on the top of one of those New York high
yeah.
rises, and then you'd have the high rises on either side that were all blown out, that sort of thing. And then me and Russell flanking Gary on either side. And he even wanted us to get these little like aubergine like dyed parts on either side.
Yeah, yeah,
I think I had mine on this side,
yeah, yeah.
and Russell had his on this side, and we stood either side of Gary, and then the rest of our hair was just dyed jet black.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So
Oh yeah.
so all of the aspect, the costumes that we wore and everything, all of that stuff I had never experienced before.
Mm,
So seeing it firsthand and kind of how important that is, especially within that genre, um, was very cool for me, to kind of experience and get the chance to do that. So I was grateful. I had a good time with the music because he just let me do what I do.
yeah.
That was his thing. I mean, he came to see a gig before we did the Warriors tour. It was while we were rehearsing. He came to see a gig that I did with my own band. And in the gig, we would do this kind of improvisational thing between me and the drummer. And it was different every night.
Mm,
And but you can do that in jazz if the musicians are good enough, because they play off of each other. It's a sort of interdependent thing that it kind of works in the heat of the moment. And at the end of the gig, Gary said, that bit that you and the drummer did in that thing? He goes, I want that in our show. And I was like, really? You want like, you
yeah,
want like a bass solo type thing in our and he was like, yeah. And he used to leave the stage.
yeah,
He used to walk off the stage and
yeah.
feature me for
Mm.
like, a good like, 3 4 minutes, that would go by, and it was insane. It
Yeah.
was insane. I remember when we played the Hammersmith Odeon, we did 7 nights back to back there, and I remember being backstage, and Mel Gaynor from Simple Minds was back there, and the band Heatwave. I don't know if you remember those
Yeah.
guys.
Yeah.
And they all said, like, man, it's insane that he's letting you do this. Like, how did this come about? This, you must have really pushed hard.
Yeah.
This, no, this is his idea.
Yeah. And it worked.
Yeah, and it worked,
Yeah.
and it was great fun. So for playing wise, and then all just the music, was the way that I approached playing his stuff. He loved it, so it was like that was very cool.
I was going to say that must have been because you couldn't. What were you been about 23, 22, something like that. But
Yeah, something like that.
and to have that opportunity to do that solo bit, well, it must have been absolutely amazing.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it was brilliant, to say the least, and just experience that type of thing. I remember before we did that tour, Gary got tickets for Peter Gabriel
Right.
uh, doing a concert at Hammersmith Odeon, and he invited us. He got tickets for all of us, and just said, do you want to go? Because I got tickets, and I was like, who's Peter Gabriel? I never heard of him. I mean, I think I might have, like, oh yeah, that guy in Genesis who
Yeah.
dresses up, whatever. I wasn't interested in any of that stuff.
Mm.
And we went and saw that band, and they were like insanely good.
Mm.
Like, this was when he had that tune called "Shock the Monkey Out" and "Salisbury Hill." It
Yeah.
was that
Yeah.
record. I can't remember what that record was, but and just the way the show was, and Gary quite liked the idea of what they were doing, and he said, I quite kind of like this whole vibe here, with this, and so it gave me the kind of experience to see, yeah, this is kind of how this is done in the pop world,
Mm.
and but the great thing about it, back then, and I do believe this is kind of dying in music these days, is the energy factor was very high back then in the
Mm.
80s. Everyone had high energy on gigs.
Yeah.
Like, I remember seeing Level 42 back around that time, very high energy. These days, like, a lot of bands just go out and play, and it's just so milk toast.
Yeah. Yeah. I know
It's
what
so
you're saying.
limp. It's so limp. There's no energy. It's almost like they're telling the band not to have energy.
Mm.
That's the thing I miss most about it, because that was, that's what I loved about doing Gary's gig. I mean, I did a tour some years after I did Warriors with Elkie Brooks, and that was the most boring tour in the world. It was so
Yeah.
boring, and it was so low energy. And literally, like, when I toured with Gary, going out on stage, I mean, we would sweat
Yeah.
so much because it was so high energy. We're moving around so much, but also the lights and everything, that Beryl had to she would sit there for ages, sometimes with hair dryers,
Right.
drying the stuff we were wearing, because it was all leather. We were
Yeah.
all wearing leather
Oh.
trousers and leather vests and stuff, and she would just sit there, with the hair dryers, trying to dry them before they left the venue,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but when I was with Elkie, it was like, I remember buying, like, I was thinking, what clothes should I buy for the tour, and I thought, I'm gonna go light, because I get, on these big tours I get hot, you know what I mean, and I had to start buying stuff to cover me up. It was so cold on that tour. There was like zero, like literally zero energy.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Well, it's
know,
different pace of music completely, isn't it? Sort of. Yeah. I know what you're saying.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, but it still could have been good, but it wasn't, sadly. But the thing is that that is what I see as a decline in music,
Mm,
you know, now, like across the board, is that it's so low energy.
mm,
You know what I mean? It's like
yeah.
no one's got any energy anymore. What's happened to the world? Like, come on, you know what I mean? Let's do some press ups or something, you know?
I do know what you mean. I do know what you mean. I remember going to some of the early gigs with Vox and OMD and people like that, and you'd get blown away straight away as soon as they came on. You know, with the
Yeah,
sound, as you say, with the energy of everything. You know, it's
yeah,
quite
yeah,
quite
yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, all those guys. And those guys as well used to hang out. In fact, you know, at one stage, we were, me and Billy Curry were talking about doing a project together, which was kind of an interesting thing. And because he was very into classical
Mm,
music, very good musician, Billy. And we hung a lot through that tour off and on. And those guys used to come down to the gigs, you know,
mm.
and you know, check it out. And you know, they liked what Gary was doing, you know.
That's a shame that never happened.
Yeah, it is. It just kind of just kind of went by the wayside. I think it was something that Billy was really interested in doing, because
Mm,
what we had talked about actually, which, and I think this would have been good with Billy, because I was talking about the dramatis thing, doing the classical thing, and that I thought it was a really bad idea. But what we were talking about with Billy was doing like a classical thing, but it was going to be like really super high energy, where like the bass was like playing the melody along with him,
right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
you know, doing it in his violin and stuff. And he had some cool ideas that we were really seriously talking about. But I think in the end, like so much in the pop industry, is that at the end of it, if you can't sell it,
Mm,
if they can't think of a way to sell it, then they're not interested. And you
yeah.
see, see, back then people were in a good position in the pop industry, the artists, because people would be willing to put up money for new ideas, even though, you know, it hadn't made anything yet.
Mm,
But they had, you know, they were thinking about, well, you know, can we make money? Where now they don't put up any money.
no. I know.
There's a difference of what's going on now. No one's putting up any money
No.
for
No.
anything, you know. So we were in a good position, but I think it kind of came to that. I had a similar thing because, you know, after that, the Warriors tour, I also got offered the gig with Kajagoogoo.
Really.
And because I don't know if you remember, uh, the bass player in that band was a guy called Nick Beggs,
Yeah.
and he's still around and does really great things. A really great bass player, and he was a friend of mine. I met him while I was on the tour. I met him in some club. I can't remember where it was, but and he was, you know, he had heard of me and he wanted to talk to me, and we kind of became friends. And uh, they had this singer called Lamal,
Mm,
and this was when they had that tune called Too Shy.
yeah.
And there was some kind of split in the band with, you know, the guys and the Lamal didn't see eye to eye about so many different things. So they split, and it happened very suddenly.
Yeah.
And Nick called me and he said, "Hey, listen, Lamal's leaving the band. I want you to join the band." And I said, "Well, how can we do that? Because you're the bass player."
Mm,
And he said, "No, the way we're going to do it is I'm going to play on the records, but when we do the tour, I can't sing and play bass at the same time. I'm
right.
not going to be able to do that." So that was a deal. And unfortunately, because I was really looking forward to it, because I really like Nick and those other guys as well, and they had some cool tunes as well, but they just didn't want to pay me anything, you know.
Right. Okay.
I mean, the amount of money that was involved was like, I said to them, I couldn't leave London. You know, I would be losing money, you know,
Yeah.
doing that.
Yeah.
So, you know, it was one of those things, you know, it didn't really have anything to do with Nick. It was his management, you know, but that's kind of where that went.
I don't think they went on to bigger heights anyway, did they? They sort of had a couple of records out and then sort of drifted away, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, I think so. And then Nick kind of broke off from that and realized that, he had to, do other things, musically, which he's done, and, I think, a few years ago he was playing with Steven Wilson, and he does a Howard Jones gig. And
He did. He played on one of Gary's records, but I've completely forgot.
all right.
It was a few years back. Someone will now be putting it on YouTube exactly which one it is, because as soon as I forget, they tell me.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't know that. I didn't
Yeah,
know.
he did. He played on one or two. He might have played on the whole album. I really can't remember. It was during the middle years sort of thing. So
Yeah,
it would have been late '80s, somewhere around there.
yeah. I didn't know that, but yeah. So and there was also a thing that me and him were going to do a single together as well. But that again, it just fell by the wayside because people looked at it. I mean, we actually recorded a demo for that,
Really?
and it was produced by a guy called Richard Niles, and who did "Slave to the Rhythm" by Grace Jones, and worked with Paul McCartney. He was a great producer, and in the end, the record companies just thought, no, we can't sell this. We can't sell it. He's the guy. He's already in Kajagoogoo. They were that that was at the time when Kajagoogoo, who was making their comeback. They had two hits actually, "The Big Apple" and "The Lion's Mouth,"
That's it. Yeah.
and that's when all that sort of was transpiring. But unfortunately, it didn't work. I mean, that's the thing in the music business. There's so many things that never work out. They never go through. A
Yeah.
lot of people have ideas, but sometimes they don't go through because of the money or the backing.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously times then were different, where you would have to have studios and everything. Where nowadays it still needs to be done, but with the internet and everything, people would tend to do it at home and
Yeah,
shoot
now
them
it's a
all
different
around.
vibe. You got a lot of stuff being done from home now,
Mm,
and of course, I guess it saves a lot of money. I
mm.
mean that everything is about money now. So, um, yeah, it's a whole different environment now. With the
Well,
whole.
I don't know, because I really don't know. But I mean, I spoke to Gary there the other year, and he said to me his album had lost him 15,000 because he doesn't make any money selling records. It's all through tours now. You know, it's sort of
Yeah,
flipped, hasn't it? Where you used to make money out of records
yeah.
and then toured it, but now you make nothing out of records and you have to make your money from touring. So
Well, yeah, because the royalty thing is
yeah,
so messed up. And yeah, I mean, that's the streaming has killed.
yeah,
It's killed music, in that sense, because no one's really making the royalties. I mean, even like the very top of the tree people make a virtual pittance in
yeah.
comparison to what they used to make.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So they're making all their money on merch and touring.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think Spotify, you get 0.002 or something for every download.
Yeah, I
So
mean, yeah, it's silly. It's just kind of weird, how that goes. But you know, it's who knows? Maybe some of those things will come back at some point. When they realize that the whole system is messed up. I mean, it's the corruption of the system. It was
mm,
always corrupt, but then once corruption becomes so deep seated, then the people that are most important to the industry, i.e., the musicians,
mm,
get completely pushed out.
yeah,
And that's what's happened, and changed everything. But back, the, I was talking to someone about this the other day. Back in the day with Top of the Pops,
mm,
there was the big scam of, you had to re-record.
I don't,
Do you remember that thing?
yeah, yeah.
So to go on Top of the Pops, there was a ruling by the BBC, and it was a very strict ruling in conjunction with the musicians union, where you had to every artist had to re-record the track,
Mm,
and they'd have to do it in a session. So a session is 3 hours.
right.
So if you take, like, for instance, let's take Godley and Cream. Do you remember
Mm,
that tune they have? You're Not in Love,
yeah, yeah.
where they sampled the entire chromatic scale with every singer in the band, and then
Mm,
that whole
yeah,
thing was just oohs and ahs and stuff, which were all done on a Fairlight.
yeah, yeah,
They took like 6 months to record that, maybe even a year. I saw a
yeah.
documentary on the making of that, and can you imagine them re-recording it in like a 3 hour session? And I used to do those re-record sessions for people. I
Mm,
would do those all the time, and it was a scam because you'd get hired, by people would call you and say, "We've got a Top of the Pops re-record." You show up, and nobody does anything because you're it's a scam. They're going to swap the tape.
right.
And they swap the tape anyway. So they hire a band of guys to come
Mm,
in and re-record a track, and then no one would do anything. You sit around, have coffee, and chew the fat, and then go home, and you get your money. And what I used to do, because I kind of felt guilty, like, I kind of felt guilty, like, going to those things, like, I'm not really doing. I haven't really earned this money. So what I would do is I would always transcribe the track I was supposed to record.
mm,
And I remember doing one with, do you remember that guy called Jelly Bean, who was Madonna's husband at
yeah,
one stage? He was like a New York DJ,
yeah, yeah.
and he had like some superfluous single out with some singer, and they were touring. They were doing a miming tour
Mm,
across the UK, and it was like this guy playing a set of Simmons drums, a singer, and Jelly Bean playing keyboards that he wasn't playing,
right.
and they would go around and do these miming tours, and they had a hit off of the back of one of these things, and they were on Top of the Pops, and they had to do a re-record. So I got called for it. As I always did, I used to transcribe the thing, and what happened was the guy from the BBC actually shows up, because they normally wouldn't.
Right.
But if they did, like, occasionally a guy from the BBC would show up, but they're in on the scam. You know what I mean? But
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
just there to tick a box and say, I was here. Yes, these guys were doing the thing. You know what I mean?
Mm, mm.
Unfortunately, on this thing, this guy was a new guy. It was like his first day on the job, and they had forgotten to tell him that it was a scam.
Right.
So he comes in, and we're talking, and the engineer's there, and they hired a guitarist. They didn't hire a drummer because the drummer from Jelly Bean, who was a guy who couldn't play drums,
Right.
he was miming this tour on a Simmons kit.
Right. Okay.
He was in the studio, and then of course Jelly Bean was supposed to have played keyboards, which he couldn't play, and so it was just me and a guitarist that were there, and then the engineer who was producing the session. And so the BBC guy comes in, he starts, talking to us, and we're sitting down, and we end up getting into some kind of in-depth conversation about something, and it was going on, and and it was kind of, we're all kind of interested in it and everything. And then all of a sudden he stops and he said, "Hey lads," he goes, I hate to break this up. He goes, "I'm having a great time chatting to you guys, and having coffee and stuff." But he said, "When are you guys going to do any recording?" And I'm looking at the engineer, and I'm looking at the guitarist, and I'm thinking, hang on a sec. I said, "Well," I said, "Oh, okay, yeah, you're right." Because Jelly Bean was upstairs sleeping,
Right.
and along with the drummer. I said, let me go get Jelly Bean, and we'll figure out a schedule of what we're gonna do, because these guys were gigging last night. And so I go out and I phone the fixer for the
Right.
session.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I said, look, I don't know what to do here because this guy is here. He wants to see some recording. And I said, she said, look, what do you think we can do? And I said, look, I have a chart of the tune.
Mm,
If we can get something going with this guy who's the drummer, maybe we could fake it.
yeah.
We get this drummer in. This guy cannot play 2 bars in time. This guy cannot play 2 bars in time. So I get the engineer had a drum machine. I get the engineer to put a drum machine loop down,
Right.
and I record the bass part, and the guitar player records his part. And luckily, as we were doing that, the guy said, "Look, it looks all everything looks good here, man. I'm going to sign this one off, and I'm going to take off." And we lucked out. We absolutely lucked out because people got banned. I remember do you remember the band Southern Comfort?
Yeah.
They lost their whole career was ended by getting caught doing that.
Mm,
But the thing was that everyone did it. When I did it with Top of the Pops with Gary,
yeah.
they just do the same thing, And we still got paid for the sessions and stuff, But that was a big thing. But there used to be in the pop industry, if you didn't pay off the radio DJs, you'd never get your tunes played.
Yeah. I know.
It was completely corrupt. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
most people are kind of, good people. They have a good sense to them, and they hear stories like that, and they go, "No, that didn't happen. That's like they'd never do that."
Yeah.
It's like when I say to people now, how many YouTube people are buying their
Oh,
subscribers.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Doing that, people look at me and go, "Well, this sounds like you're a bit jealous of this guy that has more subscribers than you." And it's like, no, it's just, it's fake.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, you remember the band Milli Vanilli?
Oh, yeah.
Well, I mean, those were just the guys who got caught.
Yeah. I know. I know.
They were the guys who got caught. I mean, how many bands faked it and didn't actually sing?
I'd
You
hate to
know?
think.
Yeah.
Probably more than we realise.
Oh, I know. I know. I mean, I had students who were gigging with major pop bands and
Mm.
coming back. And I remember this one guy came back from, this is a major band. I won't mention the band on the thing just in case he'd get some flack from it now, but because they are like major. He said, "Man, I got to book a lesson with you, man, because I've just been on this tour, and out of like 40 dates, we've like done 2 real gigs."
Really?
Yeah, they just mimed like the whole time because
Oh,
because
yeah.
they're doing a lot of festivals and stuff, and it's easier for those bands not to play than to play.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose I got it like when Gary played in '79 at the Year of the Child gig. They all mimed. I think every band mimed there because, as they said at the time, because it was in '79, they didn't have time to set everyone up because it was going out live.
Yeah,
So they didn't have time to sort of set all the bands up and do it
yeah.
to let them play live, if you see what I'm saying. So
Yeah.
in this day and age, there's no excuse really, is there?
Yeah, I mean, it should be, but there's so many things that are fake.
Mm,
I mean, that and always have been.
yeah,
Like the Manili Villi, the Manili Villi thing.
yeah,
And then remember when those guys, remember the 2 guys who were like
yep,
sort of short, fat guys, who could sing, but they didn't look good. They didn't look like those 2 young guys that they had up there, faking it. They got signed to a record deal, and their whole deal died a huge death because no one wanted to sit up there and look at 2 guys on stage
yeah.
like
I
that.
mean, I suppose it's a bit like the saxophone part in which Gary used to use live for many years. Well, it was never played live, was it? You know,
No, no.
no.
See that? Yeah, that was a thing because that he did with the sax. But I think he just cutting corners. I think that was more of a cutting corner thing.
Mm.
where he was like, I don't want to hire a guy just to come in and play sax.
Yeah, quite possibly.
You know, I can fake it, no one will know, about that, but I'll tell you what, here's a story about what happened on Warriors at one stage, because he used to use those backing tapes. There was one tune that we did, had a big like orchestral thing on it, and he wanted to change the key because he wasn't comfortable singing it. So he needed to go back to Rock City and redo the backing tracks. And he was going to fly back on one of the days and then do it and come back,
Mm.
and then we'd have it for the day of the gig. And he said, look, I'm doing this thing. And um, so what I'd really like to do is, until I can get this tracks done, would you mind just miming to this one tune? And it's only
Mm.
going to be for a couple of gigs. And I just looked at him and I said, there's no way I'm miming.
Mm.
Like straight out the gate, it's like,
Yeah,
there's no
yeah,
way I'm miming, because that's the way I was in those days. I mean, I was just like, what, mime? You want me to mime? Which in a way is kind of bad, I mean, he was my employer,
yeah, yeah.
you know, but again, to his credit, I have to give it to him. He just said to me, he goes, okay, look, I understand,
Yeah,
I understand, you're a musician, you don't want to do that. I get that. And he was cool. And
yeah,
I thought, I've got to always remember that.
yeah,
That's a lot of guys in the pop industry would not care at all, you
yeah,
know. And
yeah.
they would say like, look, you're either doing it or I'll get someone else in who will, you know what I mean? And it's like, so he had that, and as much as he wasn't really a musician's musician and still isn't, but he had a very creative sense to him. He's an artist.
Mm.
He's kind of the true sense of the word as an artist, because, the whole thing, the whole story is created by him, the characters,
Yeah,
everything, and the music is part of that, but he was, very sensitive with that, with me, knowing that, like, my whole existence was the music.
mm.
And he was like, yeah, no, I get that. No, that's not something you'd want to do. And then there was never an issue either. It was just like that. And I kind of, remembering back on it, I think, like, that's kind of cool.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
kind of cool that he did that.